Hello, and thank you. The slide will be up in a second. You'll see I'm going to be ending the talk with quite a bit of data, and that is just the situation for me to get carried away. So I have a timer here for myself. I'm not doing my Duolingo lessons. I'm keeping time. My name is Cindy Blanco, and I'm a senior learning scientist at Duolingo, and I'm really excited to talk to you today. Earlier this week on Tuesday, we released our 2022 Duolingo language report on the state of language learning around the world. And so I'm really excited to share some of those findings with you. As you'll see, our big headline this year and our data was about the impact of the war in Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees. So I'll be talking quite a bit about refugees in my presentation. But there, of course, there are implications for lots of different migrant groups and really all language learners. Should I use the clicker, or is that something I can?
The clicker seems to be a bit dodgy, so let's try to.
Next slide, please. Great. So this is just a very quick overview in case you're not familiar with Duolingo or haven't used it in a while. Duolingo is a language learning app. We teach over 40 languages and over 100 courses. Duolingo is the most downloaded education app around the world. And the courses are built around really short, we call them bite-sized lessons that take about 5 minutes to complete each lesson. The courses are constructed with our pedagogy experts who bring loads of classroom experience together with learning scientists. And a really important component for us is machine learning as well. Our largest courses right now, that's about 10 or 12 courses, are aligned to the CEFR. I think this crowd knows what that is, but I'm used to speaking to audiences in the Americas where we use a different system. That, of course, is the A1, A2, B1, B2 language proficiency standard. And our efficacy research shows that in these courses, in our largest courses, that learner outcomes are comparable to university language course outcomes. And I think really importantly, especially for the context of migrants and refugees, all our courses are entirely free. Next slide. So today, there are so many things we could talk about. You can find me over coffee breaks, but I really want to focus on why mobile apps are important for migrant and informal language learning, and then who these users are, who our learners are, and that's where I'll talk about data in our new report. Next slide. Okay, so why mobile apps? Why Duolingo maybe in particular? Next. So our mission at Duolingo is to develop the best education in the world and make it universally available. And so that means, you know, for privileged people in the US who are dabbling in a language for fun, but also for people who are studying language for really, for reasons that are just crucial to their career, to integration, to education access. Next. And so at Duolingo, our support for refugees spans a number of different areas, including access to education. We produced a documentary a few years ago to support the UN Refugee Agency petition for equity in access to education. We also created, of course, the free language materials. We worked with the Peace Corps in the past. We produced a Ukrainian phrase book for especially for journalists and humanitarian crises workers in those first weeks and months in particular earlier this year. And we provide financial support. For example, this year we donated all our ad revenue from people studying Ukrainian to some of the organizations that you see on the screen. And a reason that thinking about refugees and their access to language education is really important for us is that one of our co-founders is from Guatemala. And so he especially is really sensitive to the needs of people from Mexico and Central America and throughout Latin America in the US coming without maybe formal education in English. Next slide. And so when we think about the role of mobile language learning in the language learning landscape for migrants and refugees, I think the most important component is that it's on-demand access to continue interacting with the education. So I think you're going to find that I'm going to echo a lot of the points that Louise brought up in the previous presentation about integration and access. I think mobile apps, especially something like Duolingo, because it's free, is important because it lowers the barriers to get exposure and interaction with the language, right? So especially for refugees, but not only for refugees, time investment is a really important consideration. As Louise pointed out, the commute to getting to these classes, people's schedules, other kinds of obligations and difficulties that they might face, that it's really important for them to have access to lessons and practice in perhaps short chunks when they have opportunities throughout the day without having to commit to maybe, you know, a long class once or twice a week, and then maybe not getting much exposure or interaction in between. And speaking of exposure, we know from research that the amount of L2 or target language usage is really important for outcomes. So how much you're interacting with it. Some researchers call this everyday engagement, getting multimodal input, that I see mobile apps as one of many tools at a learner's disposal to continue getting interaction in between classroom sessions, perhaps. Thinking about technology, there are also benefits to personalization. For years, I taught Spanish, and it is really hard to give a classroom of 30 or 35 students individual feedback on exactly how they're doing. And so I think we should think about the ways that technology can boost and support in-person language resources and educators. There's some things that technology is really good at that's really hard for humans, and of course the reverse is true as well. And something like Duolingo, which does set us apart. I think most mobile language learning apps are for pay. You have to have a subscription, but with Duolingo, because all of our courses are free, we can leverage that technology and the scalability to make resources widely available at a low cost. Next, check the time, great. Okay, so now we're going to get to some of the data. Thank you. So as I said earlier this week, we released the 2022 Duolingo language report, and this is kind of a look at the year in language. What were language learning trends around the world? We have learners in all countries, and because we offer such a wide variety of languages, we have this insight into what people want to study and why, when the barriers are minimal, when you don't have to sign up for a class, when you don't have to commit to a particular term or number of courses. What do people want to study? So where is their interest? And because we have over 500 million learners around the world, it's kind of an unprecedented amount of data about language learners. Next. So the main finding from this year's language report is the incredible growth in people around the world studying Ukrainian in a show of support for the war, well, for the Ukrainian humanitarian crisis, and of course, political crisis in Ukraine. This year, over 1.3 million people started studying Ukrainian on Duolingo. And so, of course, we saw the most substantial increases right away in February and March. The UK additionally saw another bump, that's the orange line here, in May, in association with their Homes for Ukraine program. And something that I think is really interesting and important and kind of touching, encouraging, is that we see this growth, that Ukrainian was the fastest growing language all around the world, not just in the region among Ukraine's neighbors, but around the world. Ukrainian was the fastest growing language in Mexico and Argentina and Brazil and the US and in Japan. And it's just the incredible interest around the world in showing this kind of support. Next. Another important part of the report, we're going to dig into this data a little bit more, is the most popular language studied in each country. And so you can go to blog.duolingo.com where you can see this. You can stare longer. I won't let you stare at it very long. This map shows the #1 language to study in each world, goodness, in each country. And so the green here represents English. That may not be surprising that English is the #1 language to study in 119 countries. The #2 language around the world is Spanish. You'll see that in yellow, that's in 34 countries. French is #3. Those are countries in kind of the light blue. If you look at Canada and Australia, that'll cue you into the right blue to look for. But there are a number of other really interesting trends around the world. For example, Swedish is the #1 language to study in Sweden. Elsewhere in the Nordics, you can see a little bit here, is that Spanish is the most popular language to study. And so I do think there is a lot more I could say about the most popular language, but I think once we get English out of the way, we kind of uncover a little bit more nuance and we have a better understanding of what people are wanting to study once you get kind of the big one out of the way. So this map, don't ever tell the designers at Duolingo that I grabbed this map off their page. If you're up here, you can see the grid lines. Let's keep this between us. This is the map of the second most popular language to study in each country. And so you can see that there's, I think there are 18 languages that make this list around the world. So I'll walk you through, there's a lot of colors here. If we start with Norway, you'll see that Norwegian is the #2 language. So in Norway, Spanish is #1, Norwegian is #2. And if you move to Sweden, we saw Swedish was #1 and Spanish is #2. And so I've marked here in these green boxes, the places where the country's own language is ranked as the #2 choice. So Italian is #2 in Italy, Finnish is #2 in Finland, German is #2 in Germany. That hadn't happened in the last, we've been doing this report for 3 years and German never ranked that highly, but now German has climbed those charts because they've accepted over 1 million Ukrainian refugees. So it's boosted German learners in the country. And also Danish is the second most popular language to study in Denmark. I must be speaking very quickly. Okay, now we're gonna have lots of time to dig into this. We don't see, or unlike some of the other education, language learning programs that we'll be hearing about today, I don't see my learners, right? So I know very little about them on an individual basis. And part of that is by design, that we want, again, lower barriers. We don't want people to feel like we're tracking them or betraying their privacy, anything like that. So these are about the only 2 pieces of information that I have about my learners on a large scale. When you sign up to take a course on Duolingo, we ask what your primary motivation is for studying the language. And we give you 6, maybe 7 options in the questionnaire. Let's see if I can remember them. It's school, work, culture, travel, family, what we call brain training, the opportunity that you're doing something kind of good for your cognitive health, and other. So there's the 7 categories as other category, that none of the others were a good fit for you. When we look at learners studying the language of the country in that country, these are the top 3 motivations. So you see across nearly all of these countries that some combination of school, work, and family are the top choices. School in this part of the world is a very common #1 reason to study. You see a difference here for people who are studying German in Germany, that they have chosen that other category. I think this is again indicative of the people who have, the Ukrainian refugees who have moved to Germany, that they're not quite studying for school, or of course, learning German has those consequences. But that's not really their motivation for studying German there. For comparison down, of course, I do know that Germany is not part of the Nordics, so that was a good comparison. Let's clarify that. Also, I've included for comparison down here are people learning Spanish in Norway. Again, Spanish was the #1 language to study in Norway. And so it's interesting to see how different the motivations are for Norwegian studying Spanish. That again, we have school, but we have school at a much higher percent. We have travel, naturally. And we have this brain training, I'm doing something good for my cognitive health. The other piece of information that I have about learners is their age. And so none of the data that I've reported today includes people who are under 13, but of the rest of the over 13 crowd, I wanted to point out, I thought this would be kind of like the simplest way to talk about the ages of learners. So of course, I'm talking about mobile apps, I'm talking about Duolingo, it trends young, but you can see here a number of differences in just how young the learners are. So those who are studying Spanish in Norway are exceptionally young. 74% are under 30. It's a really large slice of that learner group. That's really substantial. But it's lower in general for people studying the language of the country, which of course means that there's more people over 30, that there's more diversity in age groups. There are more people studying these languages, not just under 30. And even within those countries, you see a range with those studying German in Germany being I want to say oldest when I mean people over 30, the broadest range, that you have quite a size of the majority of people are over 30. And again, this speaks to who this is, like what I can get to give some sense of who these learners are and how their situation is different from people studying Spanish in Norway, people studying Spanish in the US. Next slide, so we can go back to yeah, so here are my questions and my conclusions from some of the things that I've presented today. Refugees have especially difficult learning contexts when we're thinking about time, ability to commit very strict schedules, maybe long classes that might be geographically distant from where they live for their own communities. And so how can our tools, this be as a Duolingo employee, think about like, well, how can our tools at Duolingo meet refugee learners where they are, right? I can't change enough of their circumstances. So how can I create more opportunities and more kinds of learning tools to help meet them in their own situations, as varied as they might be? And again, I'm using refugees as an example here because of that, our findings about Ukraine and Ukrainian learners. But I think that's true for all kinds of learners, even for, like I said, the US-based casual language learner. There's still demands on time and money and access. Another question and conclusion for myself is how technology can augment the work of educators and language programs in the Nordics and around the world. So where can technology support traditional learning methods? This is something that we're working on. We have a new-ish platform called Duolingo for Schools, which allows teachers to kind of enroll their students in a virtual classroom where they're using Duolingo and they can monitor their progress. They can give assignments. You must do a certain number of lessons or earn a certain number of points a week outside of the class so that you're getting this ongoing practice and exposure to the language even outside the classroom setting. Again, we know that that kind of interaction with the language outside of class is really important in predicting outcomes. And based on the data that I shared, we know there's high demand for free, accessible learning tools. And so how can we make more learners available of those options? How can we encourage them to build that into their practice? These kinds of low stakes, fun ways to keep working at the language in these ways that fit with their schedules and their situations. Next slide. And now, right now and throughout the day today, I'd love to hear your questions and have more conversations. Those were my conclusions, but you might have more of your own. Thank you.
Questions from the room? You can speak out loudly because there are mics in the roof. And also, Henrik, if you can find if there are any questions from Zoom in the chat room.
Thank you so much for that really, really interesting presentation. That was so useful. I have a question about the demographics, your knowledge of the demographics of the users, because it seems to me in the work that I do, I come across a lot of migrants, you know, in the labor market with very low schooling background that would really benefit from something like Duolingo. And at the same time, that group is exactly the type of group that has difficulty perhaps using Duolingo because they have no schooling background. So I'm wondering if the statistics you're providing about the percentages, you know, using this for school, work, and family, the people using it for work, do you know anything about the demographics of those? And do you have any thoughts about how to raise that number?
Yeah, so I would be able to look at it by age. I haven't, so that age was for all learners, no matter their motivation. We'd be able to look by age, but we don't have additional information beyond that. One piece of information that we also have is what language the learner is learning from. So thinking of German, you could learn German. You know, we have a German course for English speakers, we have a German course for Arabic speakers, we have a German course for Turkish speakers, and so we could look at the learners' first language, you know, the language they're learning through. That might also give some indication, but that's what I have as far as demographics. Thank you for the question.